So yeah, maybe a short recap of why we reached out to Sunrise from Antwerp. To us, it's kind of self-evident that the challenges we face in our society today are of a global scale, like climate change, obviously. Thus, the only sensible way to face these challenges is on a global scale as well, and together with a global community. It is also both a truth in historical experience, as seen in the successes of contemporary social movements, that achieving anything meaningful requires people of various organizations to come together to the most successful social movements are often coalitions. Some of our partners in Belgium already engage in coalition building. For example, we participate in the global strike, but there's also yearly anti-racist protests, the feminist march every year. But often it remains focused on a single action, once a year, for example. And we wonder how organizations can build strong and sustainable coalitions and big, broad coalitions. And for that, of course, when I met Angela in Glasgow, I was very happy because Sunrise is one of those organizations, at least from our perspective. So I would like to ask you, Joshua, what is, can you give a short overview? What is Sunrise?
Sure. Yeah, Sunrise, here's the catchphrase as is known is, Sunrise is a movement of young people dedicated to stopping climate change and creating millions of good jobs in the future and in the process. Listen, it's you know, that's the way it's summed up, but really we're just a bunch of kids who are trying to fight for our future. That's as simple as it is, as all of us are, frankly. So yeah.
And how many of those kids do you have fighting for their future?
Well, I'm going to use pre-pandemic levels because everybody has experienced a little bit of a hiccup, if you can call a once in a generation global pandemic a hiccup. You know, we had over 400, I think over 500 hubs throughout the country in the United States. And that was where we were at our peak. The amount of people, I would say, estimates range from tens of thousands to just a couple hundred. So it really just depends at what you're looking at. Right now, we're at a much smaller level and trying to look for an effort to regrow and come back to our previous levels. We're definitely still above the thousands numbers, but around there, I would say, is where we hover.
That's an incredible number. Of course, since we are in a country which has a population a little bit larger than New York City, I believe. So, can you please give us some insight? How did such a movement grow? Like, where did it originate? How did it spread? How did it grow so big? And maybe also, or how did it grow so big and remain intact? How did it remain functional?
Yeah, well, I mean, the history of Sunrise is that it started in 2017. The original front loaders, or the original, the founders, were folks who came out of prior environmental organizing, divestment campaigns in particular, and many of whom also had experience on organizing during during the global recession and the financial crisis, particularly during Occupy Wall Street, which was, another one of those big mass movements in the U.S. And so that's really where it started, where it had its foundation. And then from there, building up and scaling up to decide what is the way in which we can really make the climate crisis, climate change, actually come out off of the lips of politicians and make it a particular political subject that matters that matters to people, that politicians feel they actually have to take a position on and take policy positions on and actually move forward on it, right? And so that's really where it evolved out of, and was the effort. And from the first significant major action we held, where we occupied Nancy Pelosi's, or the Speaker of the House's, office in the 2018 elections, to the entire course of 2019, which occurred where we had instances in early 2019, February of 2019, where we just asked a simple question of U.S. Senator in California, Dianne Feinstein, whether or not she would support a Green New Deal, and that went viral, all the way to the protest that happened in Kentucky, to against the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, to the climate strikes, the global climate strikes of 2019, which were the largest global climate strikes in the history of the world, let alone, in the United States, we had a pretty significant showing and played a significant role in that, right? That was really just the growth. It just spiraled from there, and really built off.
You are referring to the one at the UN, right? At the UN summit, I believe, was the biggest global strike ever, I think.
I think yes. When the UN, what that wasn't COP, that was the General Assembly, I believe, was meeting for that year, and there was the protest that happened in, was that November or September?
Yeah, something like that.
And like, how many people were present? Just out of curiosity.
I couldn't tell you, because it wasn't even just the United Nations, right? It wasn't just it was, I mean, there were definitely hundreds of people out there, thousands of people out there, but like, it was across the country, right? It was across the entire country where protests were happening. And so hundreds of thousands of young people came out to really make sure that politicians, global dignitaries were actually responding to the demands of young people.
And these various hubs, because you talk about it very enthusiastically, but also very easily, like, oh, there was this thing happening in Kentucky. Oh, we were in LA, we were in New York. Did these hubs like pop up spontaneously? Is it almost like, is it like the Fridays for Future groups? Like, is there just a bunch of kids that are like, hey, I like what these guys are doing over there. I'm also going to start a group. Or how does it happen?
Yeah, I mean, you basically described it as pretty spontaneous. People are like, yo, Sunrise is really dope. I want to do that too. And then they, organize in their community, form a hub with some of their friends, and start to have actions and protests, and scale up from there.
Okay, that's amazing. And maybe like, how does it all link together still? Like, what's the structure like? Like, how do you decide on an action? Obviously, you guys do gigantic actions. I mean, if you see the mobilization for the strikes or for the protests you guys do, but also like occupying Nancy Pelosi's office. I mean, to get into Congress and occupy a part of it is only something we can imagine in Belgium. We would never gain entry to parliament like that. But like, how do you decide on these things? How do you make sure the as we say, the noses keep in the same direction?
So Sunrise is pretty decentralized. So when I'm talking about hubs, those are just basically local groups of young people who came together and decided they wanted to take action. We have this thing in Sunrise called the Rule of Three, which is that any three people in a specific place can gather and take action in the name of Sunrise. And so usually that is how hubs are forming. And so on the general or very, very local basis, that is where actions happen and where change is occurring, where, folks are advocating for and demanding that, like, oil wells be shut down, or, a transition to renewable energy, or an increase in solar energy, or to decrease the cost of, actually getting access to solar, or any number of things, right, that are related to environmental issues. And so that's really at the local level where a bunch of change is being made. And then we are all under the umbrella of the national organization, which it determines, like, what campaigns and strategies are being used in particular moments. And that's really the way it's just this loosely loose system, and a lot of the central direction comes from the national organization. As it pertains to how the big actions occur, that also usually is coordinated at the national level with assistance from specific hubs, depending on where the action might happen. And so usually that's how it will play out, where the national organization will say, this is an action we plan on doing. Let's figure out how we make this happen, what logistically needs to happen, and then bringing in everybody together to make sure that we can actually all go and participate in this set action. The last action, actually, there's a few ones. There was a few significant ones actually that happened last year. There was this mobilization against Senator Joe Manchin, who was responsible for killing the Build Back Better bill, which was, of course, the bill that had over $500 billion in it for climate action over the next decade. It would have been the first and largest investment in climate action in American history. He, a coal baron from the red Republican state, or from the red state of West Virginia, who is, he said he wasn't going to support the bill and killed the bill. And so what we did was decided we would respond by making his life a living hell. And we did. And so the national organization coordinated among a significant number of hub leaders, and we're like, hey, we're going to be doing this thing, and we want y'all to come out and help us plan it and make it happen. Folks were coming out to DC and New York and all these other places, and we're like, let's make it happen. And they coordinated amongst each other, kept it small and inside, and well, it played out pretty well. We made his life a living hell.
Now, when you say making his life a living hell, can you explain further?
Well, we have termed, he has a new nickname, Joe Manchin. It's Maserati Mansion. And the reason it's Maserati Mansion is because he, at an action in DC, was driving around in his little Maserati. And before he actually got to the Maserati, he was exiting like his yacht or whatever, right? He has this yacht in DC. And he was exiting the yacht, and we were, showing up to his yacht every single day. I was not one of those people, but I'm just, explaining, how people did this. They showed up to his yacht every single day. And then one day he happened to be traveling from one place to another. It was into this parking lot or whatever, right? And we just, folks surrounded him and started like letting him know, like, why are you killing, like, why are you not fighting for us? Why are you killing our opportunity at a future? Why are you destroying lives? Why are you not supporting young people? And why are you killing Build Back Better? And he, was just like huddled with his people and like trying to protect, but you made sure we made some noise. He went into the parking lot or whatever, got in his little Maserati, and we surrounded the car and, told him what was up. Folks blocked him at several points, and he kept trying to, we made his life a living hell. Went viral on social media, went viral on Reddit, and Maserati Mansion was trending at the top of Twitter for a full day and a half. So, that's the type of stuff we do.
That's amazing. I am wondering, did you face any backlash from that action? Because we had a similar situation in Flanders, where one of the ministers for the environment started making all kinds of weird conspiracy theories that we were funded by the opposition, and she was informed by state intelligence, like by Secret Service, about what was behind our movement and behind the climate protests. And so we sent her a lot of texts saying, like, do climate undertake some action here, like do what is right, support the kids. We basically flooded her phone with that, and then she came on TV like completely she lost it a little bit, made those claims, and eventually she resigned. But we faced, or at least the group that did that that action of like messaging this minister massively, got a lot of backlash. Like, they were dragged on TV, they had to explain themselves. Like, the general atmosphere towards it was very negative. So how was this received for you guys in the US?
Well, it's a little complicated, or actually not that much. Well, I'll try to break it down as simply as I can. a lot of our organizing is attacking, the Democratic Party in particular, because they are the only ones who have been even remotely receptive to having any action on climate change, as well as intersectional issues, versus the Republican Party, who really doesn't care and could, would burn, what is it, drill baby drill? That's like their whole thing, right? We have received backlash from people who are, activists within the Democratic Party before. But for this particular action, it was different because, first of all, this is Joe Biden, the leader of the Democratic Party, the president of the United States. This is his legislation. This is his hallmark piece of work. This is the thing that he wanted to pass, right? This is his effort. And we were saying, yeah, pass the bill. And one or two members of his party in the U.S. Senate were responsible for killing said bill, but in particular, Joe Manchin. And that is what has angered members of the Democratic Party for so long, is that one senator would not take his energy and effort and actually, just support the legislation that the overwhelming majority of his party supports, that the leader of his party wrote, right? And so we actually got a lot of support from the Democratic base because we were fighting for the same thing that, they believed in. We did receive a little bit of backlash, though. Like I said, there were some members who said that this was ridiculously stupid. One of those folks is a campaign consultant within the Democratic Party. She was responsible for a lot of the current Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, when he ran his presidential campaign. She was responsible for, I think, communications. I think her name is Liz Smith or something like that. I mean, she responded, I don't think to this particular action, but to another one against Kirsten Sinema, saying, how is this actually helping? You're not moving him to your side. It's not smart politics or whatever. And frankly, I mean, the last thing what to her is moving people to your side is making compromises on our future, right? And so that's not something we planned on doing and will ever do. So that's the type of backlash we did receive, but it was small in comparison to the support we actually did receive, because we were fighting for we're not just fighting for, the Democratic Party's own agenda, right? That one member of the Democratic Party was like, oh, I'm not going to pass, but we were fighting for our futures and our lives. And, young people have the moral authority in this fight.
I fully agree. Kato?
Yeah, I have another question. I'm just wondering, because here in Belgium, whenever we try to do the bigger youth movements, some radical actions, a lot of people don't feel comfortable with it, or and the more intense actions, like the text messages to the minister that we had, I don't think that they were led by Youth for Climate or the Fridays for Future kind of people. And I was just wondering, how do you build the courage and the capacity in young people who aren't really I don't know, wintered activists, or who maybe are still trying to find their way in activism, to do stuff like that, because that's something that we've been struggling with. Most of our actions have been really nice, climate party style or informative stuff, or maybe some fun symbolic actions, but not a lot of youth seems to be able to be motivated for really intense actions. Sometimes maybe, but it's not our biggest or our strongest point. So I was just wondering, how do you get to that point with youth who are already maybe hesitant or still trying to find their way, and then to get them to do such very intense stuff? Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, I think the answer to this question is, first, it was young people who decided to make the change, make this an issue in the first place, right? If it weren't for us, the Green New Deal wouldn't be known in Democratic circles as it is, right? the Democratic politicians, the Democratic presidential candidates in the 2020 election during the primary wouldn't have felt that they had to even take a position on the issue of climate change and the Green New Deal. So first, it starts with the fact that young people are the ones who made this an issue and changed the narrative in the media and in political circles around this in the first place. And so then the second step from there is to be like, look, we have the power to make change. If only we're able to, if only we take, advantage of our own individual agency. And as I named before, the fact that we have the moral authority to affect the change that we believe, like these are our lives, our futures. You damn sure better believe that you need to be listening to us. And so that's the second step, is to really just like raise the expectations and the belief that you can actually affect real, genuine change if only you're willing to take that step. And so that, I would argue, is probably the second step to this. And then I think probably the third and final thing is just a matter of training and education around like actions and support and how this occurs. A lot of folks feel uncomfortable, but I also uncomfortable taking these actions and steps, probably because, they're worried about, I don't know, will I get arrested? Or, is something going to happen to me or my future? And I would argue that, like, well, you don't have a future if the planet burns. But also that, like, when you understand the way actions are being conducted, and you also are a part of designing said actions, you gain an experience that you don't necessarily have absent that. And so it's valuable to just get the experience of organizing in and of itself, because it allows you to be able to be like, oh yeah, I can do this. I can do this with my friends, and build a sense of camaraderie with each other.
Yeah, the second thing that you said really reminded me of that, like, we live in Flanders, and a lot of the times people here are like really apologetic about taking up space. So that might also be something. Like, a lot of the times young people or other people are just like, oh no, I'm sorry, like, oh please go ahead. So it's just like this weird mentality that's going on here. So that might also be part of it.
Probably could use some American bravado. Let's. I want to talk as well a little bit about the goal you guys, or your big plan, like the Green New Deal. You've mentioned it. We all probably have a sense of what it is, but can you maybe give us the pitch for the Green New Deal as well?
Sure. The Green New Deal is an intersectional document that believes and understands that the climate crisis was made possible by the systems that allowed for the exploitation and oppression of Black and brown folks, the most marginalized folks, and by the extractive fossil fuel economy, which was perpetrating those harms. And so the Green New Deal says, we see the problem, which is the climate crisis. We see the systems responsible for the problem and the actors within those systems who have perpetuated the harm. And the solution is to change the system entirely so that people are actually supported with living, supported to have and live with the basic human dignity that everybody deserves and should have the opportunity to access, right? Which is why the Green New Deal doesn't focus on, like, trees and polar bears, right? The Green New Deal focuses on systemic shifts, right? Medicare for all. Why would we need that when we're talking about environmental issues? Well, because in part, one, currently people who experience environmental racism and experience, climate injustice are already harmed with having less access to healthcare and, being poisoned by lead, or breathing in the toxic and noxious fumes of gases spewed by, by either power plants or whatever they are, right? So clearly there's a need for access to healthcare, but secondarily, as the climate crisis continues to play out, more and more people are going to need to get access to health-based institutions in order to fight back against the effects or the health complications created as a consequence of the climate crisis itself, right? So that's one thing, right, with healthcare. We could talk about people having access to a livable and just wage, right? That is another thing that is a part of the Green New Deal. Why? Well, frankly, the fact that we are trying to transition from an economy that is based on on fossil fuel extraction means that people need to have the opportunity to transition from fossil fuels to renewables in such a way that they are supported and able to live full lives, and in the same way that they are able to as if they were employed by the fossil fuel industry, although that itself is a misframing, because the fossil fuel industry oftentimes it does not pay people living wages, does not pay people what they should be deserved, and does not provide equitable protection under labor law, which is why we should be under a just transition providing those same things. The fossil fuel industry either neglects or doesn't provide at all. And so when we talk about livable wages, why does that fall under Green New Deal? Because people, one, deserve the basic human dignity of being able to access and live their lives on a fair foundation. And secondly, because it's just necessary for us to actually be able to transition from fossil fuels in the first place. So healthcare, living wage, what else? What about free education? Well, free education matters under the scope of the Green New Deal, because as we are doing this transition from fossil fuel to from a fossil fuel based economy to a renewable economy, people will need to be educated about the particulars about how to make this happen. And so as education becomes more expensive and student debt like balloons, frankly, we should be getting rid of all of that and removing the barriers for people to be able to access education, so that so that we can transition and build the the intellectual reservoir of people who can actually lead the transition in terms of designing technologies that better put us in a position to fight and combat the climate crisis, right? I mean, I wouldn't also just limit it to that. We also can look at the fact that, like, this is a feedback loop as it pertains to healthcare, right? Healthcare, as I described, is something that people need more access to under the scope of the climate crisis. Well, as we are doing that, we should probably be educating a lot more people to become nurses and doctors. And so again, removing the barrier that education, access to education creates would enable us to, again, bolster not only that, but also the ability to combat the climate crisis directly. And so with the Green New Deal, I've talked about 3 issues, but there's more. There's also decarbonization, of course, as a key part of this. But what the Green New Deal fundamentally is a document that reflects a need for systemic change from a fossil fuel extractive and oppressive economy to an economy that is livable, just, and equitable for all people.
Yeah, I think I have like a small question, because this seems like a very cool and like really progressive document, but is it like the same one? Is it something that you guys are proposing, or is it something that is already put through parliament or accepted? I don't know what's like the status on it. Yeah, what's like the political tea about it around it? I don't know.
Sure. So the Green New Deal as legislation, for example, exists as a resolution in Congress, and it was put forward by Senator Ed Markey in the Senate and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2019. And so because it is a resolution, it is more of like a statement of values as opposed to a document that holds the full weight of the law, right? But even just the statement of values and getting that through would represent a sea change in the way in which politicians view and need to take action, right? Not only it means that we can hold you accountable to a resolution you co-sponsor, right? Didn't you say this is what you wanted? Didn't you say you wanted Medicare for all? Didn't you say you wanted to have tuition-free college? Didn't you say you wanted to have everybody to have access to a livable wage? And didn't you say you wanted everybody to have a good job? Didn't you say you wanted everybody to have, the support, senior care, and we can hold them to account because they said they signed on to this, right? And their actions in the legislature don't reflect that. So that's one thing. But secondarily, I would say that the Green New Deal as a resolution extends, there's policy that extends from the resolution. So even though the resolution has no binding legal quality, right? We would argue that the statement of values allows for the opening of people to create, politicians in particular, to create policy that is a reflection of that statement of values. So there's a few examples of that. Cori Bush has created a bill, I believe that's the Green New Deal for cities and states. where there's several pieces of Green New Deal legislation that exist that would have, the binding authority of the law. The Civilian Climate Corps, which is something we really fought around. It was our last campaign in 2021 to get included in Joe Biden's Build Back Better legislation, which was originally described as $140 billion to invest in a jobs program that would allow the federal government to employ 10 million Americans to build climate resilient infrastructure, to support and invest in frontline communities, to work with folks so that they are able to just live in a world that is experiencing the climate crisis. And that's the basis of that legislation. So that statement of values has opened the door for several pieces of legislation that do reflect those values. And so that's what we're seeing play out as a consequence of that Green New Deal resolution being introduced and being popularized by the likes of Sunrise.
I can only comment hallelujah to that entire explanation. Like, it's amazing to hear it come out of your mouth. You mentioned that it's an intersectional document. I would like to zoom in on that for a moment. And I have two questions about that. Let me start with this one. What does it say about the relationship the U.S. has with other countries? Like you mentioned, extractivism or an extractive system. Obviously, the U.S. and Europe especially have had a very long history of going to other places, stealing everything that is even remotely valuable, and leaving behind a gigantic mess. Belgium very much included with Congo and the other former colonies of Rwanda and Burundi. Does the Green New Deal say something about this like international dynamic?
It absolutely does, right? The Green New Deal, as I said, is intersectional. That means it believes in decarbonization. It means it believes in a transition from a extractive capitalist economy to one that is actually supportive and actually benefits and helps and supports the basic human rights and needs of anybody in society. It means an end to the fossil fuel industry. It also means decolonization, which is why we support and are in strong, Sunrise is in strong support of indigenous sovereignty in the United States. And we've seen the indigenous movement really be strengthened and start to be uplifted a lot more by environmental organizations, like as a consequence of young people, frankly, moving to a point where like, this is something that actually needs to happen, right? But that's not all, right? There's an internationalist lens to the Green New Deal, right? We want to make connections between the climate crisis and the exploitation of countries, particularly in the global South, right? We don't want to push for something that just creates another sense of the same economy that fossil fuels, I think it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who said, we're not trying to create, go from like, oil barons and oligarchs to solar panel oligarchs and wind turbine oligarchs, right? We're not trying to do that. We want a fundamental shift in the system. And so that requires us to have an internationalist lens that says we are not for the continued exploitation of countries who have experienced the brunt end of the climate crisis and who will continue to experience the brunt end of the climate crisis as a consequence of action that was not of their own, but of countries like the United States that is responsible for 25%, I think, of global emissions historically, and that is responsible for exploiting and extracting from the lands of indigenous peoples, as well as exploiting and extracting from lands that from people from countries in the global South, right? Like, that is what it is. And there's an additional part to this, right? Military intervention, right? Not just intervention. The United States military is one of the largest emitters of global, is one of the strongest, holds a huge amount of responsibility for global emissions, particularly in the United States, right? And so it is, frankly, there is no world where a transition to a climate, resilient economy, there's no world where we are actively combating the climate crisis and are not actually applying an internationalist lens. That also includes actually paying and reparations to those who are suffering from the exploitation that we are responsible for perpetrating, right? Like, we need to be willing to step up, especially as the wealthiest economy in the world, frankly, only as a consequence of the exploitation of those in the global south, as well as indigenous people in this country and those who were enslaved. You know, that wealth was created off of the pillaging and the exploitation and the killing of marginalized groups. And so it is incumbent on us to act in such a way that reflects a desire to remediate some of the harm as to the highest degree possible, to the best of our ability, that was perpetuated by our government. And so that is also something that is a part of the Green New Deal as a document.
That's very much for me. That's incredibly amazing. My second question is one Kato maybe can chip in on, because you've done some research on this subject. The climate movement in Europe is, to a certain, I don't want to say stuck, but definitely has been limited in a white middle class population, and has not managed very well to break out of those limitations. Do you believe it is this intersectional point of view, this vision statement, which opens up your movement, which makes that in its activities, in its appeal is maybe the wrong word, but in what it stands for? Do you think that is partially responsible for why Sunrise has such a broad like support base?
I would definitely say that as a approach that we take, having an intersectional lens is necessary to not only, you know, combat the climate crisis itself, but to build a multiracial cross-class movement. However, I would not limit it to that. I would actually say that that is just the beginning. You actually achieve a cross-class multiracial movement when you are making it a priority to organize within communities who experience and are experiencing the worst impacts of climate crisis, those who are on the front line. What that means is that we can't just be going out and holding actions, right? We can't just say we're going to hold a protest on, I'll just use the recent one, March 25th, and you know, we're going to make sure that people come, right? It means we have to be more intentional about how we are approaching this. We can't just expect that people are going to set aside all of their, you know, their daily experiences in life, cast them aside because we said we're going to hold a protest and we expect you to come. What we actually have to do is make clear, one, that these are our values as it pertains to an intersectional lens. Two, that we are intentional and want to build a cross-class multiracial movement. And three, that we're actually going to do so by working in communities to uplift those who are experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis right now. This is not I will say here, I will try to offset some of your maybe fears about like this just being a European thing. Yeah, Sunrise is experiencing it too. We are in a moment right now where we are intentionally trying to think about how we can shift and more intentionally bring in those who are, you know, coming from different backgrounds and who are, again, experiencing and are at the front lines of the climate crisis. And what we have found thus far and where we are headed is that we need to do a lot more work in our communities to understand the particular issues that they are facing, and then do the work necessary to build relationships in those communities and work with them to say, okay, what are the issues you are facing and how can we help to ensure that you are organizing for the power you need to change those issues, right? I'll give an example. I'm from Los Angeles, like I said before. And in one of the communities we're organizing in, Watts, it suffers from, you know, lead and industrial waste being deeply embedded in the community, an accumulation of industrial waste over several decades in the soil, lead in water piping, as well as in the soil itself, and in walls, and in general infrastructure, lived infrastructure, right? And so people in that community are experiencing, are experiencing environmental racism. And so what we cannot do is come into that community and say, these are the problems you're facing, we're going to fix them for you, this is how you do it. And then say, come go do an action with us. What instead we should be doing is talking to people about the issues they are facing. And these issues might be some of the ones that are coming up, although it could be something else, like the fact, police brutality. They could be talking about access to good education, fair livable wage, right? All the things that come under the framework of a Green New Deal, because it is systemic. And being like, all right, we see this, we hear what you have said. Now, how can you, as a person who is experiencing these issues, how can you organize to change it? Because the truth is, the people who are experiencing the crisis are the ones who, or the problems, are the ones who actually need to be responsible for affecting the change, right? That's why young people are organizing around the climate crisis. We are going to experience the climate crisis more than anybody who is, in power right now, because they're like 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, some 80 and 90. They're not going to experience the crisis the way we are going to experience the crisis, which is why we need to be the ones to organize to save ourselves. And so the same logic applies to working in a particular community so that they are able to organize and build power amongst themselves so that they can then, affect systemic change. And what our responsibility as organizers needs to be is to uplift their work, those who are already doing the work, and make the connections between the particular experiences they are having in their communities and the broader systemic issues that they are facing, right? So in Watts, like I said, people are facing environmental injustice and racism. And they are also probably facing other issues. I can name, I said police brutality. That is an actual issue that people are facing in Watts. If the issue for them is police brutality, first and foremost, then we should figure out a way to say, well, that is a problem. And we want to help make sure that you are able to change that. And then for us to be able to make the connection between the issue of police brutality and that of the climate crisis. Well, police budgets consume a lot of the general budget in most cities in the United States. In Los Angeles, the police budget accounts for about 54% of our general fund. And so in order for us to be able to do anything, including, get more green space, increase access to green energy, fight and combat the issues of environmental racism in communities like Watts, in order for them to get renewable and good infrastructure, it means that they need more money to do so. In order for them to get that money, it has to come from somewhere. If the police budget is consuming 54% of the city's budget, that is clearly a place where it can come from. On top of the fact that which means that if you are facing an issue of police brutality and police are receiving so much of the budget, clearly a change needs to be made there in order to prevent the police from having continued access to that money when they are making the community a lot worse. But secondarily, what does the community want to do with that money? They want to invest in themselves and build themselves up. And so how do we do that? Take the money from the police budget and invest it where it needs. And one of those places are in the resilience of the infrastructure that they have, to change the piping in the community so people are not drinking poisoned water, to transform and remediate the soil so that people are not being born with, being born and affected by, genetic issues as a consequence of the poisoned soil that they are born upon, right? So that is the type of connection we need to be making. And then not just making that connection, but like I said, maybe 2 or 3 times already, making sure that the community is organizing themselves and building up leadership expanding the scope of their expanding the scope of their support, and not relying on a passive method of, hey, we're having an action, we want you all to come, and being like, no. We are creating an action as a community and building out our power and expanding the amount of people who are actually participating by actively working with them and saying, we are going to change the system because it is affecting us individually. And that's how you build a cross-class multiracial movement, by being intentional about how you're building support.
Okay, is it okay if I quote you on some of this? Because I'm actually writing my bachelor's thesis about, so like diversity and in the climate movements in Belgium, specifically more flatteners, because that's the area that I've researched already a little bit. So yeah, this is making a lot of sense, because like, in my experience, what I've learned in my research, I've interviewed some of the biggest climate organizations in Flanders, what they're doing, the way they're trying to work for it, and they're really like patting themselves on the back for it. Also, it's more like the story of trying to include people by inviting them, and like this really passive way of trying to decolonize themselves. That's what they're calling stuff like that, which is, to me, depending on the organization, I can understand it or not, because one of the organizations is Greenpeace, another one is a really small organization. So yeah, the thing here in our area is that like within these environmental circles, this kind of like just these realizations, they're being made by people, but there's no action being, there are like hardly any action being put towards them, except for action like, oh, we're trying to work on it, and yeah, stuff like, yeah, maybe we should work together. Or like one good thing that's happening is a lot of climate activists are going to Black Lives Matter strikes to show support. That's one of the things that I actually think they're doing right. But like it's really like not going much farther, like in the way that you described at all over here. And what I've heard from a lot of different groups, all the conversations in the organizations about diversity, about decolonization are very internal, very for us, like for the internal organization, which makes it like, I don't know, just there's like this really big lack of reaching out and sincere support, in my opinion. And yeah, just like the way you framed everything would fit nicely into my bachelor's thesis. So if I could maybe quote you on some of it, that would be great. But yeah.
Sure. Not a problem at all.
Okay, thanks. Yes. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would take it a step further with some of the stuff I've said, is that like the reason, well, I won't say the reason why, but I think that the people, I'll say the reason. I think people, a lot of, especially in whiter, wealthier organizations, are scared to simply just ask people what they want, which is really what it is. And then they feel like they're not in their lane, especially environmental organizations. And I think this is the key thing really, is that we're not environmental organizations. We're not. We are climate orgs, which means that we are talking about the climate. We're not talking about polar bears and trees. We are talking about a global issue. And in order to truly deal with this global issue, you need to be able to say and embrace the fact that this is not simply limited to the color green. This is about everything and everyone. And so you don't have a particular lane. Your lane is everything. In order for you to tackle these issues, you need to embrace that, because in the communities that I come from, right, people might experience, climate issues, but like a lot of people are just trying to figure out, how am I going to be able to put a roof over my head and keep a roof over my head, right? How am I going to be able to make sure that I get food on the table for my family, my children? How am I going to make sure that I am going to be able to take care of ourselves and that we are able to just continue to live, right? And for a lot of people, that does not manifest in the the climate is going to collapse in 8 years and we only have 8 years left to that is important, but it is not what a lot of people are experiencing in their everyday lives. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that that is not a situation. In fact, a lot of people in the global South do continually experience the impact of climates every single day, right? Like, you know, you could be talk about what we in the US call this the Northern Triangle, right? And how the reason there are migration patterns the way they are from, or there are a lot of immigrants coming from Central and South America to the United States as a consequence of climate-induced drought in the Northern Triangle, right? So that is the type of thing where it's like, clearly climate change is responsible for, you know, inducing you know, the experiences of these folks. What we have to be very clear about is that, you know, in particular areas, in your area, especially if you're doing local organizing, it's not going to look like that for everybody. You might end up in a community, like I said, that is experiencing environmental racism and is very clear, but it's not the #1 issue for them, right? Like I said, Watts does experience environmental racism and environmental issues, but they also experience a number of other issues, including a lack of access to healthcare, police brutality, you know, issues of a multitude. And to be able to understand what that community is specifically wanting, and then be able to work to make sure that the community is able to affect the change themselves that they want to see, and then also make the connection between the change they are making and the systemic problem, and how that enabled the climate crisis and how these systems enabled the climate crisis in the first place, and how there are issues in their community that relate directly to the climate crisis that they want to see solved, right? Fundamentally, what we want to be able to do as organizations is build power to win. If you are not talking about winning as an organizer, then you are not an organizer. Let's be very clear about that. You want to build power, because that's the only way you'll be able to affect change, the types of changes we want to see, which are systemic, large, and you know, a sea change from the status quo. And that requires us to be able to, you know, have an analysis of the system and say that the system is the problem, and we need to win enough power to change the system. And that's really what a lot of this comes down to.
It's as somebody from a working class background and family who was who tends to, you know, have to count their single euros sometimes, or single dollars as it would be in the US. It's very much a relief to hear you say that. I don't want to keep you too long, but I would like to talk about your theory of change, because we've talked a lot about people power so far, but there are two other characteristics in or two other elements to your theory of change. And one of them is political power. Now, you guys very openly and very clearly work with politicians within the Democratic Party. You are very clear about working with AOC and other politicians. You very clearly endorse them. You actually actively take part in campaigns. You give endorsements, etc. Can you please explain a little bit the importance of that from the perspective of Sunrise? Because civil society in Belgium, for example, first and foremost, we don't have a two-party system. We have a coalition system, a proportional system. But civil society in Belgium, while it does tend to interact with politicians, of course, otherwise you couldn't get anything done, it doesn't often do so openly. It doesn't give endorsements. It doesn't engage in campaigns like that. Could you please explain, like, why is this so important for Sunrise, that it is one of your three elements in your theory of change?
Sure. I mean, it comes from a systemic analysis of how power operates in the United States, right? What are the avenues by which people are able to actually achieve change? First, that starts with people power, as we named multiple times here, right? People are the root of any power in any country. Like, it's just true, right? When people talk about the 99% versus the 1% or anything like that, that is just, it is a reflection of an analysis that says people are the root of our power. People are our power. So it starts there. But secondarily, it is an understanding that the political system is the system by which, you know, changes happen, right? Like, you want to see a particular policy pass, well, you got to go through the political system. You want to see, you know, a Green New Deal actually resolution passed and signed on by every member of Congress, you got to go through the political system. You want to see Build Back Better passed, you got to go through the political system. You don't want to rely on one single senator from a red state of West Virginia who is a coal baron and is invested in a bunch of, you know, has several conflicts of interest and is also the chair of the Senate Energy Committee for some reason in the Democratic Party. You need to go through the political system, right? And so that's really where it comes from. And that's why we participate in political campaigns the way we do. We understand that in order for us to be able to affect the change that we want to, we need to have champions, Green New Deal champions, who will stand by us as we are advocating for this systemic change. Now, let me be very, very clear. Political power is important, but it is not where our power comes from. I emphasize this because there has commonly been a misanalysis from a lot of people where people say the political system is the only way by which we win, right? There are folks in the Democratic Party themselves who criticize us for the actions we take against Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema because they believe that you just need to win 2 more Senate seats and that will really change the situation. Now, I'm sorry, but you know, there's always going to be somebody standing in our way. There will always be somebody standing in our way. And there will be a way by which they will change the situation, right? Fundamentally, we shouldn't be, Build Back Better is a compromise. It is a compromise. What we originally wanted, and the candidate we endorsed in the presidential primary for the Democratic
Party. I believe
Party,
you called it the Green New Deal Junior in one article, Sunrise.
There's a lot of names we could give it. Green New Deal Junior might be one. I might be a little harsher. I wouldn't even call it the Green New Deal Junior. I would call it something else. I don't know if I could say it here, but anyway, it's small in comparison to what we originally wanted. And if we had the power to enact what we actually wanted, we wouldn't care about Joe Manchin because we would have been able to enact it anyway. And that is a reflection, is the difference between relying entirely on political power versus relying on people power. Political power, relying on political power will only get you so far. But relying on people power and building the movement that can actually force politicians to listen is exactly the type of thing you want. We may have been able to hold several actions against Joe Manchin and make his life a living hell, but that didn't change his mind, did it? And even if it did change his mind, it still would have only gotten us Build Back Better. It wouldn't have passed the Green New Deal. And so if we actually did have the movement that that movement of young people dedicated to stopping climate change and creating millions of good jobs in the process, we wouldn't care about Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema because the president and the rest of the Senate, the rest of the Congress would be reflective of the values of a movement who actually elected Green New Deal champions, right? There would be no ability for them to deny the role of the people and what the people want. Building people power is where it's at. So again, it is important that we understand the role that political power has in this broad scope in terms of our theory of change. But let's also be very clear that until you really build a multiracial cross-class movement of hundreds of thousands, millions of young people, you will not be able to get the change that you want to see. Because fundamentally, it's not affecting people at where they're at, and they're going to be passive, right? You want to actually get people to vote Joe Manchin out? Maybe you should start organizing before Joe Manchin himself is going to make this decision. If we were in a position where we had built the power we wanted and had strong people power and stuff like that, not only would it not matter that Joe Manchin himself was compromised by fossil fuel interests and believed that things needed to go in this specific direction, it would mean that he would understand that he will not be a U.S. senator in the next election because the people power we had built would be strong enough to reject him and replace him with somebody who could actually vote in the interests of the people of his state and of the people of the United States in general.
that seems, at least to me, like a very strong strategy, which I think will, at least I will definitely discuss with more people, among which those present here. The third element of your strategy of change is building a network, an extensive network of other organizations and movements. So who else is in this network? Who else do you work with?
This is what we like to call the people's alignment. Movement ecology is basically understanding a system of people who are aligned in a particular sense in terms of their political values and are operating in such a way that they are moving all things toward the same central goal and direction. You could call this the left of American politics. And within that movement ecology, we have worked closely with several partners, from unions to other political advocacy organizations, immigrants, justice and rights groups, to voting rights groups, to it's a wide breadth and range of partners who we work with. And so that is something that is a feature, in part a feature of, that arose out of the fact that there is a feature of American politics that makes this possible. The just nature of a two-party system means you have to operate by shifting the conditions that make a specific party take certain positions. And when we talk about the people's alignment, we really, really, really are saying that we want to make the conditions for the political landscape shift in such a way that all of our priorities are reflected, from Black Lives Matter to the DSA to the Service Employees International Union to the Flight Attendants Union to the American Federation of Teachers. All the broad scope of our partners are able to get the things that we want, and they're all deeply aligned. Like I said, that's the basis of a Green New Deal, is a systemic shift that considers all of these things. Now, the National Nurses Union, all of them, right? To consider that our priorities are connected. So take it back to that intersectional point. That's really the basis of the people's alignment, right? Is this understanding that all of what we are wanting for a better and livable future for all people is connected under all of the values we are advocating for, and changes we are advocating for. And that's really the basis of the people's alignment, is building out that network. And so working with other folks, in several ways, to make sure that all of our priorities are being heard and reflected. Over this past year, we did a lot of work with voting rights groups, from the Poor People's Campaign to student organizations in Arizona and West Virginia who were demanding an end to the filibuster, which was preventing, voting rights legislation from being passed. So it's just making sure that we're being very intentional about what we are doing in order to ensure that we are building relationships and partnerships, and understanding that we are all coming from the same foundation of wanting to build a just, livable, and equitable future for all Americans and all people.
So building that people's alignment, building that ecology, what does it practically look like day to day? Like, how do you step into the office of the trade union and say, hey guys, we read your manifesto, we fully agree, let's go? Or
I mean, it really is about relationship building on a variety of levels. I will say that this, I think, also falls into the same analysis of everything being rooted in people power. I hope that's not unsatisfying, but it is very real, because if you are operating from a perspective, and Sunrise has experienced this before, where we will build relationships at the very top levels because simply of the position and name we've made for ourselves, right? We will build these relationships at the top levels, and they won't trickle down to the levels that we are holding relationships with in communities. And the consequence of that is that these relationships are only surface deep, only skin deep, right? And so it doesn't build the real power that you want to. Now, that changes when the relationships you build are from the bottom up, and you are working directly with union members who also are working in the community that you are also organizing in, building those relationships, expanding the base of support, and then, building a real sense of solidarity amongst people at the ground level, because that creates deep connections and deep senses of what we call solidarity, because it means that we are all fighting for the same thing. That doesn't happen when you have those partnerships being built at the top. Now, again, those partnerships built at the top are made possible by the power or the strength of our organizing in the past, right? From the occupation of Nancy Pelosi's office to the bird dog of Dianne Feinstein to the, wide awake actions of 2020 to the climate strikes of 2019, right? These are all indications and representations of the power that young people in Sunrise were able to build. But that was not enough. It was enough to get us in the door. It was enough to create a semblance of a relationship, but we still haven't won a Green New Deal. And part of that also means that our analysis as it pertains to relationships and the relationships we build with other organizations needs to change as well. So in terms of, where it comes from, usually it's just the fact that the door is open because of what we as an organization have been able to do, and other people see, oh, they have power, we want to be able to connect with them. But how deep is the power, and how expansive and how real is that power that they hold, and how deep are the relationships that we're able to connect? Is it simply off of the basis of the power that we've built on our own, or are those relationships being built off of the basis of a real desire for solidarity amongst each other at the ground level all the way up, right? And so it's the same thing here. I would say that if you want to talk about what that looks like at the local level, what building those relationships really look like, well, if you're organizing in your community and you are actually expanding your base of support, oftentimes the community members who you are focused on will come from different, areas. They might be teachers. Several of them might be teachers in that very community. Some of them might be, oil and gas workers, or working at a unionized a power plant or something like that, right? And so many of the people who work in the community will have jobs from a particular institution or from an industry. And if you are building real community power at multiple levels, right, in multiple areas throughout the country, then you are able to change the way membership views this particular issue, and also your organization. So let's just create a theoretical example of like the American Federation of Teachers. If we have done a bunch of organizing supporting teachers in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Boston, I don't know, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, a few, just places throughout the country, right? And they're all under the banner of the American Federation of Teachers, right? You have built this extraordinary amount of support, and you want to have a giant climate strike, and you need teachers to come out with you. And the national organization has built a strategy that says, we're going to have the biggest strike in American history, climate strike in American history. We're going to get all young people and their parents as well as teachers. Well, you're able to do that because all of those areas have built relationships with the teachers unions in their specific regions. And how that happens is the organizers from Sunrise, who are in their communities doing the work, also showed up to support those teachers in their effort and tried to figure out a way they could really support their organizing. And that's what real solidarity looks like, is being able to say, listen, we may not receive a benefit from this right now, but that's all right, because we think what you're doing is the actual right thing to do, and we support it, and we will come out and show our support, whatever, because we believe it is also of benefit to us, right? Like, it's not like a direct, like, oh, you do this for me and I do this for you, in so much as it is what you are doing benefits all of us, and we are going to show support for you. And what we are doing, well, and down the line when we hold our climate strike, what we are doing benefits all of us. We hope that you'll support us too. But it's not like that, clear, like I do a favor for you and you do a favor for me, a quid pro quo per se, so much as it is really based off of a fundamental real relationship that y'all have continually built and iterated upon and strengthened. That's what solidarity looks like. It's building that relationship of strength and support with each other.
My last question for you would be, does the network extend outside of the US? I mean, obviously we are talking right now, and I'm a huge fan, if you haven't noticed yet. But similar things, similar concepts have popped up in other places of the world. The UK has, Labour there is talking about a green industrial revolution. The EU has a Green Deal, which it is proposing. All comments to be added on the side to that one as well. But does that coalition also entail, or to what degree does it entail that internationalist perspective as well?
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of work to be done, in particular on building and strengthening the extent of that coalition with an internationalist approach. I would say that the United States writ large, frankly, the United States left organizing has a lot more to do to, and this is actually where a lot of the organizations, not just climate, but organizations on the left really fail, is really creating a movement of strong solidarity with international organizations and approaches. An example of that where that has not been true, well, there's a few examples where we've seen a sea change in how that has happened. So an example would be in 2021 with the issues that were happening in Sheikh Jarrah in Israel and Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza. That's an example where for once you saw the American, not just the American left, but like broad organizations in the United States really saying like, this is a problem, and saying like, look at what is happening right now in this particular circumstance, and how this is just it's unacceptable, right? And you saw organizations like stand together and say, this is something that is wrong and we need to really like show solidarity and support of. Another example prior to that is the movement for Black Lives, and how that was like it really, I would say, in the United States, it was sparked with the death of George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, and how it sparked an international response and a desire for, changes. It's just two examples of the, reverse situation where one originated in one particular place and it had implications for the United States. And the United States had a particular and special responsibility given the role that it plays in this, in this situation, how we responded versus how in 2020, with the uprisings, you also saw kind of the same thing. And to be very clear, there is a clear line to draw between both of these things, right? The movement for Black Lives Matter, has had a very clear critique of the issue of Palestinians and Israel, right? And has had a very clear thread in terms of how they are criticizing that situation and how it is played out. And so in the same way, like we were just talking about how solidarity plays out, that's an example of how solidarity plays out, right? And how organizations then in the United States, after seeing what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, like rose up and said, this is a problem, we actually need to face the truth here, is another example of how solidarity really works, right? It's supposed to be a process of reciprocity, not via quid pro quo, but reciprocity based off of real relationships and understanding of how things are occurring, and real solidarity. And so as it pertains to international, building that international network, there's a lot of work that has to happen in the United States. And it's an issue that exists broadly on the entire left. I think Sunrise is now moving to a point in particular to make that happen. It has really played out among climate organizations. Like, I know you said we're right here talking, but like that is really where it has started to build out, and that network and the way in which those relationships are being held is now expanding because of the recognition, at least on Sunrise's part, right, to say that we need to do better as it pertains to building these relationships. So we're not where we need to be, but there's a lot of recognition that we need to make the changes to make sure that we get to where we should be.
I'm looking towards Nela and Dimitra, who haven't said that much. If you want to ask him a question, this is the moment. No? Then I am going to thank you once again, Joshua, for having this conversation with us in general. I am sure, or I am certain, there will be a lot of references to this conversation in the coming months. And I wish you the best of luck, both tomorrow and in the long term with the Green New Deal and Sunrise in the USA. I hope to hear a lot of victory stories from you guys, because what you guys are doing and trying to achieve is really amazing. I really hope you guys succeed. But if from what I heard to this evening, I feel very confident. You guys seem very determined and very strategic about it. So
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time, and for y'all being willing to listen and hear me out. I talk a lot sometimes, so I know it can be a little, I can drone on, put it like that. So yeah, thank you for your time. One more thing, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, but my name is actually Josiah.
I'm so sorry.
You're good. You're good. You're
Josiah.
totally fine. You're totally fine. But I just wanted to, if like, actually do show video or like quote, just so that, yeah.
No, I will make a note of it and I will say it in the correct way next time.
No
My
problem.
apologies.
Good. You're good.
Okay. None of you guys want to have a question anymore?
No, I just want to say thank you. It was really interesting, really
Yes,
also
thank you.
relevant.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Then I'm going to close the stream. Once more, thank you and bye-bye.
Bye.